This episode discusses a real criminal case and may contain disturbing content. All information presented in this video was obtained by publicly available sources. I do not claim to know the individuals involved, nor do I have any inside or private information beyond what has been made public. Any commentary shared is strictly my own personal observations and opinions. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to True Crime Stories. For the next several weeks, we're going to be following the trial of Kouri Richins, day by day, witness by witness. If you're only here for raw information, I do have detailed slides prepared for each day of testimony so you can follow along with just the facts and no commentary. But if you are here for a full breakdown, the courtroom drama, the strategy, the structure, and everything in between, then you've definitely clicked the right video. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this case, let me give you a quick recap before we dive into week one. In March of 2022, Eric Richins was found unresponsive in the bedroom of his Utah home. His wife, Kouri Richins, told authorities that she had made him a drink that evening, and what initially appeared to be a tragic and sudden loss later became the center of a homicide investigation when toxicology reports revealed a lethal amount of fentanyl in his system. In 2023, Kouri Richins was arrested and charged with his murder. The state alleges this was intentional poisoning. The defense maintains this was not. Before we get into the testimony, here's a quick timeline of how we got here. On March 4th, 2022, Eric Richins was found unresponsive in his bedroom. His death was initially treated as unexpected, but not immediately ruled a homicide. On June 9th of 2022, just a few months later, Kouri Richins was charged in a separate incident involving an alleged assault on her sister-in-law. On March 7th of 2023, nearly 1 year after Eric's death, Kouri released a children's book titled Are You With Me? A book centered around grief and coping with the loss of a loved one. On May 8th, 2023, she was arrested and charged with murder. 10 days later, the charges were amended. In June of 2023, bail was denied. In September of that same year, what became known as the Walk the Dog letter surfaced, a letter the prosecutors alleged was written from jail and referenced influencing the testimony of witnesses. During that same time period, the defense filed motions seeking to have the case dismissed and to have the prosecutors removed. The judge denied those motions, along with the motion put forth by the prosecutors to restrict Kouri's contact with certain family members. Fast forward to 2024, additional findings in the autopsy would reveal medication in Eric's system that had been prescribed to Kouri. March of 2024, the charges were amended again, this time adding attempted aggravated murder charge tied to the alleged incident on Valentine's Day of 2022. In May of 2024, she was found guilty in the assault case after failing to comply with conditions tied to a plea agreement within a required time frame. In that same month, a newly unsealed court document revealed that her mother, Lisa, had a partner who had died from a suspicious overdose back in 2006. Also in May of 24, her attorney at the time, Sky Lazaro, was granted permission to withdraw from the case, citing ethical issues. Around that same time, voice recordings were released to the media in which Kouri proclaimed her innocence. She was then appointed new counsel, Kathy Nestor, Wendy Lewis, and Alex Ramos. In November of 2024, the judge granted the defense's request to separate the mortgage fraud charges into a different case. The defense also sought to have the trial moved out of the Park City area, arguing concerns over impartiality. In June of 2025, additional charges were filed, and then in October, prosecutors dismissed the drug-related charges that was tied to her case. November of 25, bail was denied again. And in January of 2026, the court held an evidentiary hearing to determine what evidence would be admissible at trial, what the jury would hear, and what would be kept out. On February 10th, jury selection began. They set a jury in 1.5 days. Opening statements were scheduled, and they began 8:30 a.m. on February 23rd. That was this past Monday. So the trial has officially begun. So we're going to get into a breakdown of the week, day by day, witness by witness, and we'll cover everything that you may have missed, or maybe you didn't get to watch it, because not everybody has time to sit down and watch a whole trial. And apparently I don't have as much time as I thought either, or this video would have been released on Friday, and here it is, week 2, and I'm just now getting it together. All right, week 1, day 1. Judge Richard Mrazek is presiding over the proceedings. The court first addressed some housekeeping issues, the exclusion of witnesses, meaning individuals who may testify and they're not allowed to sit in the courtroom and hear other testimonies before they take the stand. This is standard procedure and ensures testimony is not influenced by what others may say. The state also raised questions regarding electronic exhibits that would be used during opening statements. There were objections raised by the prosecution to some of the defense's photos that they wanted to use in their opening, and the defense had objections for what the state used in their opening. Ultimately, the judge ruled that all of the photos would be allowed in. There was no concern of any of them. The defense did strongly object to one of the slides in the state's opening statements that referenced memes saved on Kouri's phone around 10:30 a.m. the morning of Eric's death, as well as one that had the planned vacation involving Robert Grossman. This is the man that was essentially previously known as her paramour because they didn't want to release her lover's name, but the state just called him her boyfriend. So that's what I'm going to refer to him as, is Kouri's boyfriend. But after hearing the arguments from both sides, because the state objected to a picture from the defense's slides showing some exotic animals that had, when you're a deer hunter, you have the head on your wall. Well, there was some very exotic animal heads on the walls, and the state objected to it because they thought that it might be a little bit too sensitive for some viewers, but the judge allowed it in. So we're going to see all that. Okay, after all of those issues were addressed, the jury's brought in, and he addresses the jury, and he gives them all the instructions and explains the role of the jury, the burden of proof, and courtroom procedure. And then he reads the charges into the record. Count 1, aggravated murder. Count 2, attempted aggravated murder. Count 3, insurance fraud. Count 4, insurance fraud. Count 5, forgery. The court also noted that the defendant has entered a plea of not guilty to all counts, and the judge reminded the jurors that in a criminal case, the state carries the burden of proof and the charges must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. He explained courtroom terminology, that when an objection is sustained, something is not allowed. And when the objection is overruled, it's allowed. With the jury sworn in and the charges read and all the matters discussed and addressed, the trial officially started. Lead prosecutor Brad Bloodworth began by walking the jury through a timeline. He took them to the evening of March 3rd. At 7:22 p.m., a text message was sent from Robert Grossman. And at 8:36 p.m., Kouri responded. Later that night, she made Eric a drink. She went into the boys' room and then returned around 3 a.m. And when she came back, Eric was cold, stiff, pale. His mouth was wide open. At 3:06, her phone unlocked. Between 3:15 and 3:19, there was recorded movement. At 3:21, she called 911. And at 3:58 a.m., Eric Richins would be pronounced dead. The state then shifted from the timeline to the motive. He told the jury that while Kouri presented herself publicly as successful, she was actually financially drowning. They alleged she owed nearly $4 million to approximately 20 different lenders. Brad Bloodworth told the jurors that she had taken out payday loans to cover the existing loans, that her accounts had been overdrafted more than 200 times, totaling roughly $300,000 in negative balances. He told them how she was scheduled to close on a property the very next day, on March 4th, taking on an additional $3.2 million in debt. Meanwhile, Eric's estate was valued at more than $4 million. Approximately $2 million from his business, $1 million from his home, and roughly $2 million from life insurance policies, including one that the state alleges that she fraudulently obtained. The state also told jurors that Kouri had planned a vacation in April of 2022 with her boyfriend, Robert Grossman. They referenced February 11th, pills being purchased. February 14th, Valentine's Day, when Kouri had allegedly left Eric a sandwich and he had a reaction. Prosecutors told jury that she later asked for something stronger. And then on March 4th, Eric's death. According to the state, Eric had several times the lethal amount of fentanyl in his system. He told the jury that the evidence would prove this was murder, and that the evidence would prove that Eric did not kill himself, and the evidence would show means, motive, and opportunity, and the evidence would show that no one else was responsible. He urged the jurors not to look at one moment of the evidence, not to just look at the moment of death, but to look at the evidence after the death. He ended by telling them that when this is over, that he'll come back and analyze the evidence that they seen, and then he'll ask them to find Kouri Richins guilty. Then it was the defense's turn. Attorney Kathy Nestor began by addressing the 911 call. She played a clip. She reminded jurors that just hours earlier, the couple had been celebrating the closing of the Midway Mansion, a property that she said Kouri planned to flip for profit. She described their home, their lifestyle, their children, and she emphasized that marriages have ups and downs, and that this one had survived counseling and conflict. She argued that law enforcement did not search everything. She pointed out that an empty pill bottle near the bed was not collected. She said that no one took the Moscow Mule drink, the glasses that it was in. She told the jurors that from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m., no one knows exactly what happened. She asked, how did Eric ingest fentanyl? She stated that the state has no direct evidence explaining how it was ingested. She noted that the death certificate initially listed the manner of death as unknown. She told jurors Kouri's story had never changed, and the defense argued that Eric's family just needed someone to blame, that they didn't want to admit that Eric may have used drugs. She said that Eric's sister told detectives that she believed Kouri was responsible and that the family had hired a private investigator. The defense claimed that the state would focus on marital struggles and financial stress because they cannot prove murder with direct evidence. The defense also addressed Eric's health, knee pain, back pain, and Lyme disease diagnosis. They claimed he was dependent on medication. They said Kouri did ask Carmen for oxycodone, but at Eric's request. They emphasized that there was no oxycodone found in the toxicology report, and they suggested Eric had traveled to Mexico weeks before his death, raising the possibility that fentanyl had came from another source. They told jurors that they would have to decide whether the Valentine's Day sandwich was truly an attempted murder, and she even said that one's going to be an easy one for y'all. They addressed the forgery charge, saying she simply signed a document that came in the mail, something spouses do frequently. She said every wife has signed their husband's name at some point. She told the jurors that they agreed with many facts that the state will present, but they dispute what those facts mean. At one point, she said, the state will show you a witch, and I will show you a widow. They reminded jurors that they are the safeguard between Kouri Richins and the government, and they urged them to hold the state to its burden beyond reasonable doubt. After the defense finished their closing arguments, we went straight into the first witness. The state's first witness was Eugene Richins, Eric's father. He testified that Eric was 39 years old when he died, and when he was asked if he knew the defendant, he responded plainly, "She was the wife of my son." He spoke about Eric's upbringing, that his mother, Linda Carter Richins, had passed away previously, and he described raising their family with strong core values: family, education, work ethic, and religion. He told the jury that Eric was outdoorsy, athletic, and a very good student, and he would always help him with the cattle ranch. He also testified that he and Eric spoke daily. They saw each other several times a week, at the ranch, at ball games, and around town. Their lives were very closely connected. He described Eric as fun-loving and likable, someone who liked people and people liked him. When asked if he was proud of his son, Eugene became emotional. He said he was very proud of him. He told the jury that Eric was a coach, a father, and most importantly, his children's best friend. Then they talked about the morning of March 4th. He testified that Kouri called him and told him that Eric wasn't breathing. He immediately called his daughter Katie and then went to Eric's home. He arrived around 4:30 a.m. He stayed at the house until around 10:30 that morning, and during that time he testified that he does not recall Kouri speaking to him at all. The state then moved into what happened after Eric's death. Eugene testified that between the time of the funeral and the release of the medical examiner's finding that Kouri had called him and told him that the cause of death was the same thing that Eric's mother had died from, plus COVID. Eric's mother, Linda, had died from a fungal infection in her lungs. After receiving that call, Eugene would then contact his daughter Katie, and Katie spoke directly with the medical examiner's office, and they were told that the cause of death had not even been released, and they were also told that the medical examiner's office had had no contact with Kouri Richins at that time. The defense had no cross-examination for Mr. Richins, but did express condolences for his loss. The next witness, Kouri Richins Benson, Eric's sister. Katie would testify that she and Eric were just 2 years apart. They grew up working on the ranch together, fishing and hiking, and they spoke constantly, almost daily. She described Eric as the most likable person, someone who would help anyone, a devoted father, and a phenomenal uncle. She told the jury that Eric taught his children the same work ethic that their father had taught them, and that family and the outdoors were central to who he was. She also testified that Eric had set aside money for his children, for college, and for homes for them in the future. She said that if Eric was ever hurt, physically or emotionally, he would call her, even if it meant it was 1 a.m. She told the jury that other than allergy medicine, she had only ever known him to take Advil, and she testified that she had never known him to use illicit drugs. She also explained how she and her husband had previously owned the home that Eric later purchased in 2012. The testimony then turned to March 4th. Katie said her father had called her screaming and crying, telling her Eric wasn't breathing. She said that she collapsed to the floor and then gathered her children and drove straight to Eric's home. When she arrived, Kouri and Kouri's mother, Lisa, were there. Emergency personnel were present, and the boys were in Ashton's room. Katie testified that when she saw Kouri simply shook her head at her, and Katie knew he was gone and collapsed. She described Kouri as not her normal self. She was wearing matching pajamas, and her hair was somewhat done. She said that there was no interaction from Kouri with the boys until later that morning. Katie testified that the boys saw emergency personnel remove their father from the home. She had been told this by her husband. Later, the boys were brought downstairs and told that their dad was not coming back. She described how Ashton was extremely upset and that he wanted his mother, and how Kouri was initially reluctant to go to him. But when she did, he ran to her and hugged her, and they sat on the floor together before being interrupted by Brianna, who was engaged to Kouri's brother. Katie testified that Brianna mentioned the Midway Mansion, and that Kouri appeared businesslike and immediately shifted her focus to Brianna, telling her what needed to be done. She also testified about Eric's Apple Watch and how Ashton wanted it. He had went and retrieved it, and Katie said that she watched Kouri take the watch, delete its contents, and then give it to Ashton. The state then moved to events later that morning and the days following. Katie testified that Kouri seemed to have a plan almost immediately, discussing selling of the house. And Katie said she didn't understand it because she could barely function. She was struggling with simple decisions, while Kouri appeared focused and organized. Katie explained that the house was held in a trust, and with Eric as the trustee after his death, she then became the trustee. She described the trust as having two main categories, one for the boys and one for Kouri, and each one would outline how funds could be distributed. She testified that although the trust allowed her to receive compensation for serving as a trustee, she chose not to. And on March 5th, the family would meet to prepare for funeral services for Eric. Katie testified that toward the end of that meeting, Lisa asked about cremation, stating that Eric had wanted to be cremated. Katie said that initially Kouri had appeared shocked, but then agreed and said yes, he wanted to be cremated. On cross-examination, the defense questioned Katie about her role as trustee and her duties. They asked whether she had spoken to a female detective, Detective Woody, in her car the morning of March 4th. The defense asked whether she had told the detective that she believed Kouri was responsible. Katie responded no. When asked whether she told law enforcement that she was suspicious, Katie testified that she told him that there had been tension and financial issues, and that she had felt an overwhelming need to let someone know. The defense asked about THC gummies, and Katie testified that she knew Kouri had some, but she didn't know if Eric had used them. They also asked about a bottle of oxycodone from 2006. Katie acknowledged that Eric had undergone a medical procedure years earlier and had occasionally taken pain medication but did not like to. She said that he even sought out acupuncture to manage the pain. The defense questioned her about her emails that she had sent investigators outlining suspicious activity dating back to 2016, involving Kouri and others, including financial concerns, the Valentine's Day sandwich, and the request about Eric's wedding ring from the medical examiner. On redirect, prosecutor Brad Bloodworth asked Katie about the civil lawsuit filed against her in her capacity as trustee. He clarified that the estate's attorney, not Katie personally, had retained the private investigator. He also asked about Eric meeting with both a divorce attorney and an estate attorney prior to his death. Katie confirmed that she had provided investigators with materials that she believed was relevant. And on recross, the defense asked about a home equity line of credit and how she believed it was forged. They asked about power of attorney and whether Eric had to revoke Kouri's power of attorney before granting one to Katie. They also asked whether Kouri had ever requested money from the estate. Katie's testimony was detailed and emotional, and through her, the state reinforced Eric's character, the family dynamics, and the trust structure. Early concerns surrounding finances and behavior immediately following his death. Next to testify would be Clint Benson, Eric Richins' brother-in-law and Katie's husband. Clint would testify that after May 8th of 2022, he took responsibility for securing Eric's home. He changed the locks. He had private security until the cameras could be installed properly. He placed tape on doors so he would know if they had been opened. He testified that if the sheriff's office requested access to the home, he would meet them there. And if the boys needed something, like a stuffed animal or personal items, he would go inside and retrieve it for them. The state then moved into the events that predated Eric's death. Clint testified about a phone conversation between Eric and Katie that occurred sometime between October and November of 2022. The call was on speakerphone, and Clint had overheard it. He described Eric as both sad and angry. He testified that Eric was on his way to their home during that conversation, and that Clint later reviewed financial records online and discovered that a home equity line of credit had been taken out on Eric and Kouri's home, totaling over $250,000. He testified that after learning this, he had helped Eric locate a divorce attorney and assisted in setting up meetings at Eric's request. On cross-examination, defense attorney Wendy Lewis questioned Clint about how long Eric and Kouri had lived in the home together. She asked, how many times had law enforcement requested access to that property? Which, in total amount, I think Clint said that it was maybe 10, 8 or 10. She asked about the most recent search of the home, which Clint stated occurred approximately 2 weeks before trial. The defense questioned him about the private investigator, clarifying that while the estate ultimately retained the investigator, Clint had initially paid him before the trust began covering those expenses. Clint testified that the investigator was hired just over a month after Eric's death. He stated that the investigator turned all findings over to the detectives. He was asked whether he personally received copies of all correspondence sent to the investigators. He testified that although he had received some, he doesn't know if he received all. He testified that when he arrived at the home between 3:30 and 4 a.m. on the morning of March 4th, he noticed what he described as an unusual shaking of Kouri's hands. When he was asked by what he meant by unusual, he explained the difference between unconscious nervous shaking and what he described as purposeful shaking, as though someone was actively trying to shake their hands. On redirect, the state asked whether the private investigator was hired after the civil claims were filed against this estate, and Clint testified that yes. He was asked what the investigator would do if he discovered something significant. Clint responded that the investigator would contact law enforcement if he had found anything of interest. The defense got recross, and the defense pressed further. They asked whether, if something were found, did the investigator call the police and tell them to obtain a search warrant? And Clint responded that he believed that's what they did. With that, Clint was done with his testimony, and they had no more questions for him. The state would then call Deputy Vinson to the stand. Deputy Vinson was one of the responding officers on the morning of March 4th. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce his last name, and I do not want to do an injustice to his name. On direct examination, he was asked to identify his body cam footage and the corresponding transcript before the video, or part of the video, was played for the jury. The state used his testimony to lay the foundation for the footage, establishing chain of custody, authenticity, and that the recording accurately reflected what occurred at the scene. On cross-examination, defense attorney Alex Ramos was very aggressive when he questioned the deputy. And he questioned whether his camera had been on the entire time he was at the residence. He asked how long the deputy was on scene. He asked about the process of uploading the footage, whether it was reviewed, and whether or not the upload was complete, and the deputy testified that it's an automatic thing. He questioned whether the deputy documented in his report when his camera had been turned off. The deputy testified he didn't turn it off until the scene was concluded. The defense asked whether he provided the Detective Woody with information upon her arrival and whether or not that information was included in his report. And then he's like, it probably wasn't included in my report, but I probably did tell her what was going on. And then he asked whether or not the deputy had searched for a hydrocodone bottle and why he didn't photograph its contents or send it for testing. And then he asked why he didn't search the kitchen sink, why the glasses weren't collected, why there were no THC gummies seized. I mean, Kouri had mentioned them. The defense also pointed out that the deputy noted the bedroom temperature at approximately 71 degrees after Kouri reportedly stated that they kept the room cold, yet there was no search conducted for gummies, glasses, or other potential substances. The cross-examination focused heavily on investigative thoroughness, or the alleged lack of it. Court then paused for the day, and the deputy's testimony would be continued on day 2. They gave a list of potential witnesses for the following days, and then they released everybody for the next day. Day 2 would move a little bit deeper into the scene itself. Day 2 began with a little bit more housekeeping before the jurors were brought in. Once all of those matters were resolved, proceedings resumed, and the deputy returned to the stand. The defense focused heavily on the deputy's interactions with Kouri at the scene, and I also have to say that today, on day 2, attorney Alex Ramos was a little bit more, he wasn't as aggressive as on day 1. He was a little nicer, calmer, more collected. They went through specific conversations that he had had with Kouri inside the home. And Ramos asked whether the deputy believed she appeared emotionally upset that morning. And he asked whether it would, and the deputy replied, yes, she seemed upset. And then he asked, would it surprise him to learn that someone else had described her as not emotional? The questioning suggested an effort to highlight differing perceptions of Kouri's demeanor. The defense then walked through the procedural checklist that deputy was required to complete when responding to a death scene. They also asked about how he secured the residence, what areas were searched, what items were documented, and what steps were taken before the detectives assumed control. The goal appeared to be examining thoroughness and consistency. On redirect, the state shifted the focus back to structure and protocol. Prosecutors asked about the chain of command that morning, clarifying that the deputy's role versus that of detectives. They reviewed his responsibilities in completing the death investigation checklist. He explained how the checklist was logged into case management system and made it immediately available to others involved in the investigation. The state again addressed Kouri's emotional presentation. The deputy testified that in his experience to responding to death scenes, her demeanor was not entirely consistent with what he had typically observed. He described it as somewhat abnormal compared to other next of kin reactions he had encountered. On recross, the defense pressed him further. They asked specifically why he believed her emotions were abnormal. The questioning suggested the emotional responses to trauma can vary widely and are not uniform. With that, the deputy's testimony was done. The jury had now heard not only what occurred at the scene, but how it was processed, how it was documented, and how it was interpreted. The state would call Cameron Larson as an evidence technician with the Office of the Medical Examiner next. This was Miss Larson's first case in the field after completing extensive training. She testified about responding to the home on the morning of March 4th and how she arrived at approximately 6:30 When she entered the bedroom, she observed Eric laying face up and a t-shirt had been placed over his face. She noted a red fluid present on his face, and the AED device was positioned on his chest. She testified that she did not observe any visible signs of trauma or external injury. She worked alongside Chelsea Gibson and Detective Woody at the scene. Ms. Larson explained that her primary responsibility was examining and documenting the body itself and not conducting a full search of the residence. However, she did look in the kitchen for signs of alcoholic containers but did not conduct broader searches of the home. She described the process that follows completion of the scene investigation. Once documentation is finished, the body is placed into a body bag and it is prepared for transport. She testified that any medications located near the body, along with the decedent's driver's license, would be sent off with the body to the medical examiner's office. She personally escorted the body out of the house to the transportation team. Across, the defense focused on her limited role at the scene. She was asked whether she had responsibility for collecting broader evidence inside the home. And she then clarified that her job was specifically related to the body and its immediate surroundings. The defense asked whether she thought it was unusual that she was asked to look inside the kitchen trash can. And she said that yes, she did think that was unusual. She was also asked about her brief interaction with Kouri. She testified that Kouri appeared to be crying with her face covered, and she stated that she could not clearly see her eyes. On redirect, the prosecution returned to the documentation. She was asked about the inventory sheet she completed, the photographs she took, her notes, and the medications that were sent with the body. She was also asked about her meetings and coordination with other medical examiner personnel, including Ms. Olson and Mr. Hopper. Her testimony reinforced procedural handling and what was documented, what was transported, and how the body was processed once it left the residence. With that, the state continued building its scene foundation through first responder and medical examiner testimony. The state would then call David Pimentel to the stand. Deputy Pimentel testified about his responsibilities on the scene during the early morning hours of March 4, 2022. He explained that he was responsible for scene security and maintaining a medical log. He testified that he searched the master bedroom for medications, looking in drawers, cabinets, and inside the cabinet above the toilet. He stated that he was made aware that there could potentially be THC gummies in the home, but he did not locate any. On cross-examination, the defense focused on the documentation and scope. He was asked about his handwritten medication log and the list of medications found. He testified that only the top 3 medications listed on the sheet were the ones that he actually personally located in the master bathroom. The defense asked about his security role that morning, and he testified that he stood at the bedroom door to prevent the children from entering the room. He was asked directly whether he was searching for illegal drugs, and he stated no, he was not. He was only documenting medications known or visible to him. The defense also asked about supplemental report that he completed more than a year after the incident. The deputy testified that he was asked to complete that report but did not know the specific reason why it was requested. On redirect, the state asked whether he had reviewed his body cam footage before preparing his report. He testified that he had to review the entire recording to ensure accuracy before finalizing his report. The state then clarified what he was specifically looking for on March 4, 2022. Deputy Pimentel testified that he was only focused on locating medications prescribed to Eric Richins. He explained that he did not conduct a full search of the home because there was no warrant and no probable cause at the time to perform a more extensive search. On recross, the defense returned to the hydrocodone pill bottle located in the room. They asked why he didn't look on top of the cabinet above the toilet. They questioned whether, in his experience, individuals typically leave their illegal drugs out in plain view. They also asked about scene control, specifically who entered and exited the bedroom after it had been secured. And with that, Deputy Pimentel's testimony concluded. Through him, the jury heard further clarification about the limits of the initial response, what was logged and what was not searched, and the boundaries of authority without a warrant. The state continued laying groundwork of what was done at the scene and what decisions were made in real time. The next witness that the state would call would be Margaret Offred, an advanced EMT with more than 40 years of experience in the emergency medical services. On direct examination, she would testify about her education, certifications, and decades of field experience. She then walked the jury through the morning of March 4th. When she entered the residence, she observed that Eric was positioned at the foot of the bed, not lying on his side in a natural sleeping position. His body was straight rather than angled or turned. She testified that he appeared cold. Her team initiated cardiac arrest protocol. They attached a Lucas device, a mechanical chest compression system that performs consistent compression so that medical personnel can continue working the code. They administered epinephrine in an attempt to restart his heart. During resuscitation efforts, they obtained a medical history from Kouri. She testified that Kouri told them that Eric had Lyme disease and may have taken a CBD gummy. She explained that first responders always assess the immediate surroundings for anything that could help explain a patient's condition. She testified that Eric's cardiac rhythm was consistent with what she described as essentially a flat line, and it never changed. On cross-examination, defense attorney Wendy Lewis asked who was present and who called in the cardiac arrest. Margaret testified that dispatch had reported a cardiac arrest, and that is what they encountered upon arrival. She explained that they had administered Narcan in case of a possible opioid overdose, describing it as a last-ditch life-saving effort. She walked through how they continued working the code, chest compressions, airway management, medications, while doing everything possible to revive him. She also testified that Eric's blood sugar was 458 and that his Gaskell Coma Scale, or GCS score, was 3, the lowest possible score. She was asked about delivering the death notification to Kouri. Margaret explained that in over 40 years in the EMS, she has witnessed many different types of emotional reactions from family members in those moments. On redirect, the state asked about the blood that came from Eric's mouth during CPR. Margaret testified that while it is not unusual to see some blood during resuscitation efforts, the amount present in this case was more than what she typically sees. On recross, the defense asked again whether the blood could be normal during CPR, and she clarified that it can occur in some cases. She was also asked about the pressure applied by the Lucas machine, and she testified that it applies standardized, appropriate level of pressure consistent with proper CPR technique, not excessive force beyond what is medically necessary. Finally, she was asked whether an untrained person of small stature might lack the strength to perform CPR effectively, and she responded yes, that could be the case. Her testimony provided the jury with a clinical medical snapshot of the scene, what condition Eric was in, what life-saving measures were attempted, and what the responders observed in real time. The state next called Andrew Krenick to the stand. And although the sergeant is a jail sergeant by position, on the morning of March 4th, he was serving in his role with the South Summit Volunteer Fire Department, assisting medical personnel and first responders at the scene. He testified about his background and experience, and while he no longer holds the active advanced EMT certification, he He had previously served as an advanced EMT and has medical response experience. He was asked whether or not he mixes his roles when responding in different capacities, whether as an EMS or a jail sergeant, and he testified that he does not mix his roles. He performs the role assigned to him in each situation. He also explained that at the scene he assisted with the airway management. He testified that he was asked to look for medications and had located an empty hydrocodone pill bottle. On cross-examination, the defense questioned him about when he took over the airway control and whether there was any blood present on Eric's face at that time. He testified that initially there was not visible blood on the face, but that blood did come up after airway intervention, which he stated is not unusual during resuscitation efforts. The defense asked about medications located in the bedroom. He was shown a photograph of the nightstand and asked about the pills that were visible in what appeared to be a pop-out card package. He testified that he did not collect those pills. He also was asked about white specks visible on the nightstand in the photograph and whether or not he knew what they were. And he testified white specks, but he couldn't identify them as any specific substance. Through the sergeant, the jury heard additional testimony about what was and was not collected from the bedroom, as well as further clarification about medical intervention and the hydrocodone bottle located at the scene. The state would then call Maggie Mobley to the stand, and she would testify about her role as a morgue clerk with the Office of the Medical Examiner. She explained that she was responsible for receiving and releasing decedents. When a case arrives, a folder is created containing all identifying and case information before the transport team brings the body to the morgue. She testifies that when the decedent arrives, she takes custody of the body and inventories any belongings that accompany it. The body bag is sealed at the scene, and upon arrival at the morgue, she is required to photograph the seal before breaking it and opening the bag. Once opened, she inventories all items inside. Any personal belongings are documented. Medications that arrive with the body are separated and placed into an evidence locker. She testified that she follows a written checklist to ensure each procedural step is completed. If the driver's license is sent with the decedent, a copy is made and placed into the case file. After the medical examiner's office completes his examination and investigation, she is responsible for releasing the decedent to the designated funeral home. On cross-examination, the defense focused on how medications are packaged when they're sent with the body. She testified that medications are typically placed in a separate bag inside the body bag. Unless necessary, she does not open that medication bag. It goes directly to the evidence locker. She also testified that she takes intake photographs of the body before it's placed into the cooler. Her testimony reinforced the procedural safeguards in place once Eric's body left the residence, documenting how items were handled, photographed, and inventoried and preserved. Through her, the state continued building its chain of custody foundation. The state would then call Pamela Sue Ulmer, a retired medical examiner who performed Eric's autopsy. She testified that she began the autopsy on March 5th at approximately 7:30 a.m. She explained that autopsies are conducted methodically, beginning with an external examination and then proceeding internally. Because this occurred during the COVID era, standard protocol included swabbing for COVID-19. She testified that during the external examination, there were no signs of trauma or external injury. Medical intervention equipment, such as defibrillator pads and needles, were still attached. She did note foaming at the mouth, which she explained originated from the lungs. During the internal examination, she observed rib fractures on the left side consistent with CPR efforts. Her cardiovascular examination showed approximately 50% occlusion in the coronary arteries, which she described as early-stage coronary artery disease and a common finding in adult males. She testified that this did not indicate a heart attack and was not related to the cause of death. On the respiratory examination, she identified pulmonary edema, or fluid in the lungs, which she testified was consistent with drug intoxication. She also observed white nodules in the lungs, which she attributed to the inhaled dust from Eric's stonemasonry work. She testified that these nodules did not contribute to his death. His liver was normal, and microbiology testing revealed that there were no infections and no evidence of anaphylaxis. He did test positive for COVID-19, however, she testified that there was no evidence that that was a cause of his death. She testified that the toxicology testing was conducted using vitreous fluid, blood, and gastric contents. Blood toxicology revealed fentanyl at 15 nanograms per milliliter, which she described as a toxic level. She testified that those levels should be 0 in someone who is not prescribed that drug. And she also explained that norfentanyl is a metabolite of fentanyl was present. And because that substance was detected, the medical examiner's office requested a full medical history. She testified that there were no indications in his medical history of illicit drug use. Gastric contents were tested through a comprehensive toxicology panel. The ethanol level measured 279 milligrams per deciliter. And she explained that this level could be due to alcohol consumption prior to death or post-mortem decompensation process that produces ethanol. And she testified that there was no way to definitively determine the source of that ethanol level. Other substances detected included acetaminophen, caffeine, quidapine, I can't say that word. It's an antipsychotic medication, and the illicit substance fentanyl. At the conclusion of her autopsy, Dr. Ulmer determined that the cause of death to be fentanyl intoxication. However, because the broader investigation was still ongoing, and she did not yet have full contextual information, the manner of death was listed as unknown at that time. She further testified regarding medications in Eric's medical history. 2 medications he prescribed are commonly used in addiction treatment. However, she explained that those same medications can also be prescribed off-label for symptoms associated with Lyme disease, and she confirmed that at least one of those medications were prescribed to Eric, and they were prescribed for Lyme disease. She testified that she did receive 2 phone calls from Kouri Richins to discuss medical information. She also explained that because there was no definitive medical method to determine the exact time of death, she had to rely on the time pronounced at the scene, which was 3:58 a.m., March 4th, 2022. She explained that preliminary death certificates are often issued quickly for funeral purposes and later amended once toxicology and investigation findings are complete. On June 6, 2022, the death certificate was amended to list the cause of death as drug intoxication by fentanyl and the manner of death listed as unknown. Dr. Ulmer's testimony was clinical, methodical, and significant. Through her, the jury heard no natural cause of death, no fatal infection, no heart attack, no toxic level of fentanyl, pulmonary edema, I cannot say these words, consistent with an overdose. And the official cause of death, fentanyl intoxication. After the medical examiner, the state would then call Allison Christensen. She would testify that on March 5th, she was responsible for handling and submitting the toxicology samples collected during Eric's autopsy. She explained that her role included ensuring that all samples were properly documented, sealed, and sent to the appropriate laboratories for testing. She testified that during the autopsy, multiple samples were collected for toxicology analysis. In addition, the primary testing tubes, a third blood tube, was retained and preserved for potential future testing at the request of the medical examiner. She testified that she submitted 6 samples for testing. She described the submission process in detail. Each sample was logged into an online evidence portal, sealed, signed, and dated. She testified that the samples sent to NMS labs were shipped via FedEx after proper documentation. If testing was to be conducted at the state laboratory, she would personally transport those samples from the medical examiner's office to the state lab. Her testimony focused on procedure, emphasizing documentation, sealing protocols, chain of custody, and preservation of samples. Through her, the state reinforced that the toxicology samples were properly handled. They were logged and sealed. They were documented and shipped through traceable means, and a reserve sample was preserved for future testing if necessary. Her testimony laid the foundation for the toxicology reports to follow. The last witness of the day would be Chelsea Gibson. She served as the lead crime scene technician, and she would testify that her primary responsibility was to document the scene and assist Detective Woody throughout the investigation. She testified that she was involved in the searches of the Richins home at least 8 separate times. Her duties included for photographing, scanning, documenting, collecting, logging, and receiving evidence. The state walked the jury through digital scans of the home that she had created. She explained that the scanning software used to create a detailed visual record of the residence, preserving the layout and conditions of the rooms at the time of processing. Jurors were shown portions of her video documentation generated from that software. She testified that part of her role was to systematically scan the house to ensure that the condition of the scene was preserved digitally and that evidence locations were accurately documented. She also introduced evidence that she personally collected, logged, and received. Her testimony focused on documentation, scene preservation, evidence logging, and repeated entries into the home over time. By establishing that she was present at the residence on multiple occasions, at least 8, the state reinforced that the home was thoroughly processed and revisited as the investigation progressed. The court would resume the next day on day 3 for the trial, and Chelsea Gibson's testimony would continue on the morning of day 3. Now, we're going to have to do a separate video that picks up on day 3 and goes through day 5 because we're already at the hour mark. So we're going to split them up and we'll do part 1, part 2. Okay? So, until then, I'll see you guys in part 2. Thanks for checking us out. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for staying with us. And if you haven't yet, like and subscribe to True Crime Stories Beyond the Headlines.